Oh man, thank you for that intro, Tim. And thanks to everybody for coming. And I'm so happy to be in Singapore because I've never been here before. It took me about 24 hours to get here, and I traveled through multiple days, so I actually time traveled to get here. So, and I will be referring to literally like all airplanes as like time traveling because that's actually what it is. So, like Tim said, my name is Mikaela, and I work at Lickability. So we are a company that is a software studio. So we just make iOS apps, and we are fully remote now. So that's super exciting. So we don't have an office, like we don't even have one to go into anymore. And I am a freelancer, so because I love iOS dev so much, instead of only doing it at my full-time job, I also do it outside of work as another job. And then I am one of the organizers of iOS Dev Happy Hour, like Tim had mentioned. So that is a monthly online meetup about to meet other iOS developers, and we share stories about how people got their first job into iOS development too. So that's my favorite part of it because you get to hear like non-traditional paths of how people really got into tech and the like struggles that they had faced to get there. And I'm also a content creator, so I create content on YouTube, Instagram, now Mastodon, and also Twitter. So today we will be talking about data. So first, just your basic, what is data? How do we store data? And the different considerations that we have to do. And then lastly, some more concrete examples of when you would actually use different ways to store data. First off, what is it exactly? So data is everything in your app. So if you don't have data, your apps all start to look something like this. And can somebody tell me when we all of a sudden decided to use the shimmer effect for every single loading screen? Because they all have it. But then Instagram just kind of does whatever. It just says we can't do anything. But this is what your app would look like without data in it. So where do we go and save data? So we have a couple options. First off, we can save it locally on the phone. So this means your data is only on the device, so if they delete your app and download again, then they lose everything. So that's usually not ideal, so the next place to save data is in the cloud. So this has all the benefits of pretty much everything that like you don't like about saving data locally is you can save it in the cloud, and so now if your user deletes your app and downloads it again, their data can still be preserved. But you can even go further than that and decide to save data in both places. So your data will be able to sync between the cloud and the device, so you have to keep your data in sync between both of them, and so you get to manage even more. But why would we want to save data only locally? One of the main reasons is if you don't have multiple devices. So if your phone you only need data to be like on one phone and that's it, and you don't actually need to like sync with an iPad, you could totally just save the data locally and not even worry about the whole cloud aspect. But then also, because of that, if you don't want to share data with others, so if you don't need anybody else to know what your app is doing, then you can definitely just save it only on the device, and it doesn't have to be shared with others. And then lastly, you get full offline support. So after downloading the app, your app will just work. You don't have to do anything else with it, and it will just continue to work without being connected to the network. So the opposite of that is why would you only want to do cloud storage? So specifically, you can do cloud storage without having a local database, but you can do it also with one. But with cloud storage, one of the nice things is backups. So you could back up your data locally on the device, but still, if your user drops their phone in the ocean, it's not going to help them any. So when you can back up to the cloud, then that means that their data is still preserved and they can get everything back afterwards. And then opposite of local is you can share your data with others. So if you have an app that talks to other people, then the data is saved all in the cloud, so everything is okay between multiple people. And then along with that is multiple devices. So like if you have your iPhone, iPad, but then also want to sync with your Mac as well, you can do that using cloud storage. So the different local options that we have. So first we have the Files app. So you can just use a JSON file, a text file, a CSV, comma separated value. You can just save that file to disk in the user's Files app. Or you can save data in what is called SQLite, which is a database, and this also works natively on iOS, so you don't actually have to add anything into your app to use SQLite. But then we, of course, have Apple, who has their core data, which is a first-party framework for saving data on the device. And it does also use SQLite as well. It's an ORM and object relational like mapping. So it maps your objects to save in a SQLite database. But you can save data not only in SQLite, but you can save it in like an XML file as well using core data. And then lastly, we have Realm, which this is a local storage offered by MongoDB. So they advertise themselves as an alternative to core data. And instead of saving like objects to like a SQLite database, they use what's called an ORM, or not an ORM. They use object mapping is what they call it. And that is how they save the objects directly to their database. Now we have our cloud options. So first, everybody knows of Firebase. It's one of the most popular ones. This is it's called a BaaS, a Backend as a Service, because SaaS, but I gotta add another letter in there. So we have a BaaS. It's a Backend as a Service, and this one is offered by Google. So of course, next one is Amazon. This one is called Amplify, and it's offered by AWS Amazon. And a new up-and-comer is called Superbase. So this one literally says, we are a Firebase alternative. So if you don't want to use Firebase, you have Superbase. And then lastly, I put Postgres up here, but you could do any other custom database. So you can save your data to all of these places, but then if you don't want to use any of these, you could like DIY it and roll your own database as well. But then we've done like local, cloud, but then there's the options where you can use both of them together. So you have CloudKit and Core Data. So this is Apple's solution to save data and how you sync the data between your local and cloud. Realm has what's called Device Sync, which is offered by MongoDB, so that's Mongo's logo. And then you have Amplify and AWS. And AWS is very much an umbrella company, so you can do a lot of different things with it as well. But then Firebase also has their own local caching too, but it's only one icon, so I couldn't like put it over to the side or anything. So I'm sorry, Firebase, you don't get an icon on here, but this is they have that as well too. And it's enabled by default, so you don't even have to do anything to also have local databases with Firebase. But how do we decide which one to use? So we've talked about what are all of our options. So if you were to go ask your iOS dev friend that I hope you met, one out of your 5 new friends that you have, the first thing that they are going to tell you is that it depends. So what does it depend on? The first questions they'll start asking you, okay, is what does your app do? What does your data look like? How much data do you have? And then how will you use that data? And all of these are good questions, and they depend on everything else, but these are the first couple questions that you're getting. So let's break down what are all of these options. First, when we talk about what does your app do, we're typically talking about offline capabilities. So like we had mentioned, we have cloud and local, but how do you want your app to work offline, or do you want it to work offline? Because I play a game called Heyday, and they do not operate offline. Like you can't do anything if you're not connected to the network. So you have to be online to use their app. But other apps, like any kind of flight app, that has to work online because when you're flying, you don't have an internet connection. So what kind of offline capabilities does your app have? Do you have multiple devices? So again, are you connecting to your iPhone and your iPad, but then maybe also connecting to a watch? What does your app really start to do? And then sharing data between users. Are you going to share it between one user, or is it multiple, or is it everybody? So once you post one thing in an app, everybody could see it. So all of those are considerations you have to take into account. And then lastly, there's also backups. So do you want to back up your data, or kind of just save it to the cloud and not back it up at all? Then we start talking about what does your data look like? When somebody tells you this, they're really talking about relationships. So how is some of your data related to other parts of it? So if you have a classic like invoicing kind of system, you have invoices, but you also have customers, and then you maybe have products. All of these things are directly related together, and how you form that relationship is really what people are saying when they say, what does your data look like? And then how do you use the data? So we've talked about what the app does, but how do you personally, as a developer in your app, use your data? So typically that's how are you fetching the data? In what ways are you filtering and sorting the data? But then also authorization, so who can access what? So let's break a couple of those down as well. So first, when we fetch data, this is kind of talking about how much data do you want to have in RAM. So if we were saving our data as a JSON file to the disk, if this file is like 5 gigabytes, do you really want to load 5 gigabytes into your app at once and all of it is existing in memory at that one time? It's like if you're scrolling through Instagram, you don't all of a sudden see everything at once. You only see a couple posts, and then when you have been doom scrolling, you get to the bottom, it has to reload again. And that is because you're not loading everything at once. But given that, depending on how much data you have, that could then affect performance. So what does your data look like then goes back into, is it only text or is it also images and video as well? And with fetching data, the next thing you're going to do is how do you sort that data and how do you filter it? So when you fetch data, fetching it out of a JSON file, we are fetching everything at once. But if you start filtering it, so we want to filter and only fetch maybe 3 out of 5 things, then you only ever have 3 things in memory as opposed to having 5 things. So with that, you have complex filtering, so this is really like, does one thing that you have and that you're fetching also depend on like the next thing that you're going to be fetching? So you have to wait for the first thing to come back before you can go forward and fetch any more. And then lastly, with offline support, this goes back into what do you want your app to be able to do while you are offline. So like I have Notion on my iPhone. When I am looking at one page, I can definitely like look at that one page, edit all the data. But if I went and tried to navigate like to a page that I haven't been to in a while, it just says you can't do it anymore because it's not up to date, because they only really had that one page in memory, but you have to be connected back online to do anything else after that. So that would be more of a partial offline versus fully offline. You can do whatever you want and it'll sync to the cloud once you connect back to the network. And lastly, you have authentication and authorization. And these are actually 2 different things. So authentication is who are you? So are you who you say you are? And then with authorization, it's what can you access? So we've confirmed you are who you say you are, and then now what part of the data can you actually go about accessing? Like you can see your own DMs, but you can't see other people's DMs because that's weird. But with this, it's sharing the data. How do you share data? So when you're DMing somebody, you want to only talk to the specific person that you're talking to or add other people into the conversation, but you don't want that to be like broadcast everywhere. So we've talked about all of these things, but let's go into more concrete examples of what they would really look like and when we would use them. So when we're using files to disk, again, this is everything will be in RAM at once. So if you kind of only have a small amount of data, say megabytes or so, you could definitely put all of your data just in a file and load everything at once and then save back to that file when you are done. So you don't really want to have too much complex filtering because once it's all loaded into memory, that's when you'll have to filter it. But then, and you don't want to have complex relationships with this because loading like three different files all together to assemble all the data at once, the app will then take a while to load as opposed to if you did some other solution. So the other solution you could do is use SQLite. So this, you would probably use it if you already have a knowledge of SQL, which is called structured query language, and that is basically just the language that you use to fetch data out of a database. So you can use SQLite, but if you're not familiar with it, there's other solutions that you could use rather than using this. But it is really cool that it's first party, not by Apple, but SQLite is integrated as like a first party. So you don't even have to import any libraries to use SQLite. But there are other libraries that let you wrap all your commands from SQLite because it's like a very C-based library and it looks very C-like. And I don't know if that's anyone's cup of tea. But with this, you also have relational data too, because it is a full database. So you can do complex filtering and everything, but again, if you only save this to your device, then you don't have that cloud aspect with it. So given that, you can move on from saving your files to disk to moving over to saving your data into core data. So this is, again, the first-party solution by Apple, and it uses SQLite under the hood, but it can also use XML. and you can do all sorts of kinds of filtering and sorting that you want. But the really nice thing is with core data and then pairing it with CloudKit is that you don't have to create a login. And that's the next thing we'll talk about, is that the person just has to like use your app, and they can just use that, and you don't have to have any kind of sign up screen, because everything just works. And that's very nice if like I undownload apps like immediately. If like the first thing they do is present a login screen, I'm like, well, I don't even know if I like your app. Like, why do I want to go about creating a whole new account just for that? So going from core data, you could move over to Realm, because core data is a party by Apple, but with Realm, it is third party and it is open source. So if there's something you kind of don't like about it, you could just go look at the source code and change it if you would like. So that's super nice if you don't really like the things that like the package itself is offering. It's an object-oriented data model, so again, we are saving the objects directly into like their database as opposed to wrapping objects like from a table. And then again, you do have the cloud sync part with this, so you have Realm plus device sync, which is offered all by MongoDB, because they recently bought recently, actually, I don't think it was that recent, but they had bought Realm. And what's nice is when you do have third parties, you have to start thinking about logins, like we had said. So different cloud options offer you different kind of logins. So I wrote down that MongoDB lets you do, I wrote this down actually a different slide, but they have like your basic login, sign in with Apple, sign in with Google, but different social logins too, if you want different things. Oh yeah, then that was all the local options that you have, and then going into the cloud options, we have CloudKit, which again is a first party by Apple, no login required, and one of the big things that they give you is privacy. So if you are saving data to somebody's personal iCloud account, you cannot see that data. So you can't like go log into the CloudKit dashboard and see everybody's data. That's literally not possible. So because of that, it's very privacy oriented. But then with Firebase, it's again a big third party, and you have all sorts of stuff like authentication, authorization. It is a NoSQL database, so instead of saving data structurally in SQL, there's also NoSQL. So I go into that more in depth, and actually I have a YouTube channel, which I'll post at the end, of a talk that I gave at 360 IDEV, and that one I go more in depth on what is the difference between SQL and NoSQL. But with this, all of Firebase's options are NoSQL databases, and they have two, which is Cloud Firestore and the real-time database. You can store pictures and video in cloud storage, whereas don't store like video inside of like SQLite. Don't do that. But then you also have open source SDKs. So again, if you kind of don't like what Firebase is doing, you can go look at their code of how they're fetching data and change it the way you want to. But you don't see the backend implementation of everything. And then they also have what's called a REST API, and this is basically just a way that you use to fetch data. And with the, this was the slide I wrote the notes on. The social logins that Firebase has available are Google, Facebook, sign in with Apple. They also have Microsoft and Yahoo, if anyone still has a Yahoo account. But they also have custom auth sign-in, so if you have like your own custom authentication, you can integrate that with Firebase as well. But then Amazon has AWS Amplify, and Amplify is the name of like their sort of mobile web services, because AWS has like 1,000 things under the sun, but Amplify is sort of the one that we use as iOS developers. And their NoSQL database that they use is called DynamoDB, which is just a different kind. You can also store pictures and video, and this is stored into what's called AWS S3. So that's just the service that they use for storing their data. And they have a REST and a GraphQL API. So again, these are just two different ways to actually go about fetching data. What you get in your app could be the same in the end, but how you write the code to fetch your data could change. And one of the biggest benefits of using AWS would be all the backend products that they have. So again, it's like an umbrella of a bunch of different things. So with that, you can tap into all the different AWS services that there are. And then the up-and-comer of Supabase is trying to be a Firebase open source alternative. So it's completely, oh, I totally did not write that on the slide. It's completely open source, and that's the whole point of it, is they're trying to do like more privacy focused and just have it like built by the community. So with this, you actually are using what's called a Postgres database. So this is a SQL database, so it's more relational, instead of Firebase's NoSQL databases. But their API they give you is both a REST and GraphQL API. The biggest win with this one is you can quickly spin up any database and spin up the API, and everything kind of just works. But one of the biggest cons of this one is that right now it's very web-focused. So they have a Swift package that you would import into your app to go about using it. But compared to the JavaScript package, I looked last night, the JavaScript package has 628 commits on it right now, and Swift's has 58. So if you want to use Supabase, it's open source. You can go and contribute to it right now. But we still have more commits than Ruby, which only has 15. But then lastly, we have our custom backend. So with this, you can use all sorts of backends. You can do anything and everything that you want using any kind of technology. So with this, though, you have to do a lot more database management. So if you don't want to manage your database, don't use this one. And with this, you have to manage the backend itself, meaning you have to spin up some kind of server and make sure it's still running, because unlike Firebase and other solutions, that's all handled by a third-party company, so you don't have to worry about the computer itself if it's running. But if you do your own custom backend, you do have to worry about things like that. And the biggest benefit of using a custom backend is the fact that you can do anything and everything that you want. So if you don't like the way Firebase or Amazon does something, you don't have to use those, and you can do your own. But the biggest drawback of this one is definitely security. So Amazon, AWS, or that's the same thing, Firebase and AWS, they have teams dedicated to security, 24/7, 365. They are making sure that your data is secure. But if you try to roll your own backend, you have to worry about those things, as opposed to when you have your own, or other companies, you don't have to. But rolling your own backend, it's really great. You can do anything and everything, which is really exciting. But then you also have to do everything, and that is not as fun. But given that, don't worry, code is ephemeral. Whatever you choose, you can always end up changing it later. So we've only been doing iOS development for the past 15, 17 years, since 2007. So no matter what you choose, it's only been a couple years, something will change, and all your databases will change, and it's totally fine. You can always move and migrate to what you're doing later, but some migrations just are more painful than others. Thank you.